Hello again and welcome. We are back with our podcast series focused on 5 things training wants the business to know. Our podcast series over the next several weeks is with Susan Minaya, COO, Chief Learning Strategist, and Executive Coach, again talking about 5 things training wants the business to know. Last week, she talked with us about the second thing, training is a strategic partner. This week, Susan talks with us about, you guessed it, the third thing. Stay tuned to learn more. Hello, Susan.
Hey,
Welcome back.
Dario. Hey, thanks.
Yeah,
Good to be back.
I'm excited to hear about the third thing training wants the business to know. I'm on the edge of my seat here, so what is
Are
that?
you?
I am,
Okay.
yeah. What is it? Let's get into it.
All right. The third thing is that training should be a budget line item. Yeah. Well, I felt this was an important thing really, to share with you because in my 20 years of learning strategy development with organizations, I am always absolutely floored and amazed at how often it isn't actually a budget line item.
What?
Yeah.
Who pays for training? Where does the training get money?
I know, it's a great question, right? That's what I'm like, well, how much are you spending? Where is it? So it is a great question. So let's start with the first one you asked. So who pays for training, right? So to be sure, somebody's paying for it. Sometimes it's buried in a talent development line item, and it doesn't have a lot of granularity, though. That's the problem with those big top labels and budgets, because we can't really get to the actual spend. And learning leaders need to care a lot about that. We don't get that granularity or the ability to really differentiate between training versus coaching, say, versus mentoring. So this, learning leaders need to be able to slice and dice their spend against results, because, these are important components of talent development. So going back to, for the training piece, as a learning leader, this, level of granularity is very important for me to understand from a funding and analysis perspective. So I know what spending am I doing and what kind of result is it getting me?
Wow, that seems crazy to me.
I know, right? Well, this often indicates that the learning organization isn't really probably able to tell a story around their efficiency, their effectiveness and their cost mitigation. They can't isolate that data because they don't have it laid out in a way that they're able to pick it up, identify it, and use it in their analysis. So now back to your question about where does training get the money? The answer to that is it depends.
The age-old answer.
That's right. Because for training organizations, there's different models, right? And in a centralized learning model, the funding sits all under the training organization. And while that seems like really convenient and nice and tidy, we've got our arms around it, we know what's going on, it's also hugely cumbersome for large organizations. It's really not very agile, right? So in a federated model, the funding sits all over the organization in different divisions. Everybody, the business has buckets of funding for their initiatives that they want to do. Learning has certain ones. They kind of have centralized functions for the rest of the organization. It's really important to track that, but that can also be very difficult. It can cause a lot of siloed divisional training. So it may be working great for one area in the company, but because it's their dollars, they don't really take the time to stop and go, hey, who else might be doing this, or who else might need this customer service training besides just us, right? So this is how we get to where there's 5 versions of communication or leadership training within the organization. And you know what? This drives learning leaders absolutely crazy.
Yes, it does.
And the learning organization can't easily capture that spend, since it isn't viewed as a co-owned line item. They don't really have a lot of say in how the business wants to spend it. So don't get me wrong, I really like federated models. Where I see it being a problem is in organizational alignment for areas of strategic importance, right? And redundancy, which means wasted money.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, I see what you're saying. There's an opportunity there.
Oh, indeed there is. But before we go there, let me bring up one more little budget challenge, okay? It's called robbing one budget bucket to do the training they need or want, right? Because they don't have the training budget, or they used it all already, and darn it, I want to do this training thing, and so I'm going to take it out of this other area where I have some money still sitting, So this often happens when training doesn't have the financial ability to conduct training that their business client needs. And then they go looking for where to pull the funding to make it happen, right? So they might go to training even though they They don't have the budget. I need to do this sales training. And they say, well, we don't really have the funding for it. And he's like, well, I could go get it and I'm going to pull it out of this other cost center that I have. And so that's really robbing Peter to pay Paul, right? Essentially.
Yeah.
And the problem is that money is coming from a bucket that's never going to be tagged as training dollars spent. So what happens is that, this is funding that's coming from a totally different cost center area that can never get tagged to training, right? So it's just money that looks like it's from there. And so training doesn't get the credit for that initiative or whatever is being done. And they don't get to track results for it against it. So that's where I really see the challenge. So as a learning strategist, when I hear this, I know there's money getting spent for something. The organization has no idea for what, right? So it can't really be captured other than that it was used. And that's just irresponsible. I personally think it's irresponsible. And this is what happens when there isn't a defined training line item on the budget.
It really just sounds like a whole bowl of spaghetti, honestly. It sounds like a bowl of spaghetti. Does this really happen in organizations?
Yeah, it absolutely happens in organizations all the time. But most don't really pay attention to it because until someone like me comes in to do a learning strategy and shines a light on it and says, hey, it's always an interesting conversation when a client that I'm working on learning strategy with asks, how much are we spending per employee for training because of how they're not categorizing budget for training? I have to just look at them and go, I don't know. I shrug my shoulders. It's just a guess, right? Because there's so many places it could be coming from. We just have no idea. And they're spending the money. Don't get me wrong. They're spending money on training. They just don't know how much or where, right? And this makes, guess who? The CFO crazy.
Everybody's getting their little dose of crazy from this, it sounds like.
All right, so enough of that. But shall we talk about the opportunities that this offers?
Yes, please. I need to move into the light.
Yeah. I put this as a third thing because actually, thing one, learning is a profession, and thing two, learning is a strategic partner, are the solution to this challenge, right? So I mentioned the federated model where funding is distributed, and it can be challenging, but it is the strategic partnership of a learning leader with the business that ensures everyone knows what the other is doing to properly capture the spend, right? So that redundancy we talked about earlier because of siloed decision-making, it can also be alleviated through shared governance, right, over the learning function. And so you've heard of governance models for the learning organization, and bringing business leaders and learning leaders together to make these sound decisions about where they're going to invest training creates shared accountability for the money, right? The funding that's there, even if it's sitting in many places, right? So we collectively agree this is what we need to do. And I think a shared governance model for learning in that environment, what I love about it is everyone's accountable for the spend. And everyone cares about the results that the spending is achieving. So we kind of agree on this is what we're going to go. Collectively, we all have this big bucket of money. We know our strategic plans. Where do we really need to invest in the money? And of course, the divisions will have additional funds to do like their independent things they have to do. And that's okay, as long as it's coming out of the right budget line item so we can track it. So that's how the business and training work together for training budget.
That's pretty slick how you tied those three things in together. Okay. I didn't see it coming, but I see what you did there now. Okay.
It all goes back to partnership, and it really works. So to the business, I'd encourage you to talk with your learning leader about how funding for training funding is allocated, right? So how do we track it and manage it for the good of the organization, and how might governance maybe path for you and your organization toward responsible and visible spending on training and results accountability?
Well, thank you, Susan. That wraps up this podcast session on the third thing training wants a business to know, which training should be a budget line item.
Ching, ching.
Save everybody the crazy. Okay. We have 2 more things to go over in this series. Tune in next time to hear about, you guessed it, the fourth thing. Until next time.